please talk to me about what was going on in Cuba prior to the coup by Batista. What were the conditions that led to that and enabled him to do that?
Well, Cuba was going through a constitutional democratic process under the two auténticos administration, that of President Grau San Martin and then Prio Socarrás. Since the revolution of 1933, Cuba had began to have periodic elections, democratic elections, and these were significant periods in which Cuba was very democratic, respect human rights, freedom of the press, no political exiles or political prisoners, and also Cuba was progressing economically to the point of being at the takeoff stage economically. There were some problems of graft and corruption, which became a very big problem. There was problems of gangsterism and violence, and the military that existed in Cuba, although the higher echelons of that military have been changed, they were primarily supporters of the Batista leader, the military leader that was involved in ending the revolution of 1933 and had been president of Cuba from 1940 to 1944. So as the elections of 1952 approached, there were a number of factors that happening in Cuba. One, the suicide of Eduardo Chivas, the leader, the most popular leader of Cuba, the leader of the Ortodoxo Party, who left the Ortodoxo, a very important political organization, leaderless and created a political vacuum. The Auténticos, which were the party in power, began to lose support, in part because of the corruption and in part because of the gangsterism that occurred in Cuban society at that time. Nevertheless, probably either the Ortodoxos or the Auténticos would have won the elections of 1952 with other candidates. Batista was also a candidate to that election, but in the polls he was third, and he knew he wasn't going to be able to win the election. So in a very surprising event, took over the government, staged a military coup, and took over Cuba and started a dictatorship. Fidel Castro was a candidate for the House of Representatives in that election as part of the Ortodoxo Party. Fidel Castro was a member of the Ortodoxo Party.
How likely was it that he was going to win?
Not very likely. Sure, the coup was relatively easy in part because of the support of the military, in part because of the way it was done very in the middle of the night, in part because the president didn't stage a fight. He decided to seek asylum in the Mexican embassy. So really power passed into the hands of Batista and the military very quickly.
What was the nationwide reaction to this?
Well, one, skepticism. Second, unhappiness because Cuba was going through a democratic process. Not a massive uprising or massive opposition. The students at the university and certain groups immediately began to plot against Batista and began to organize against Batista. The Cubans were shocked that a return to militarism in Cuba, that the constitutional process had been interrupted. And this was highlighted by two events. 1952 was the 50th anniversary of the establishment of the Cuban Republic. And next year, 1953 was the 100th anniversary of Martí's birth. So there was an element of pessimism and sadness in that, particularly among intellectuals and writers, looking at where Cuba was 50 years after the Republic and 100 years after Martí's birth, that the Cuban had returned to militarism, that Cuban society was mired by this kind of problems. Yet, let me emphasize that Batista promised elections immediately in 2 years and promised to return Cuba to a democratic process. So Cubans in 1952-53 remember that Batista back in 1940 allowed free elections in Cuba, that in 1944 allowed free elections in Cuba. So the perception was not of a long dictatorship or intransigent political leader that was going to remain in power indefinitely, but of a military caudillo that had taken over temporarily and was going to return Cuba to the Constitution of 1940 immediately.
What pretext did Batista use publicly for his coup? I mean, there were democratic elections about to take place, and now he's promising democratic elections. It's like, thank you, we already have them.
The excuse, which was not real, was that Prio was planning to fix the election and support an authentico candidate to win, and that the election wasn't going to be honest. And this is absolute nonsense, and this was an excuse by Batista. For Castro, it was a downside and a positive side. The downside was that he couldn't be elected, and he was having hopes of being elected to the House of Representatives. He was a candidate of the Ortodoxo Party. The upside is that he gave him an opportunity to use his skills to become violently involved. And if we understand Castro, one of his commitment at the university and before that was to violence. So he was interested in using violence to achieve political power. So now he had an object to attack and an object to fight against, and that was a military dictatorship in Cuba. Castro had a reputation of a tough guy at the University of Havana. He had been involved in gang fights. He shot one student at the university. Prior to that, he was involved in two events: the Cayo Confites expedition against Dominican dictator Trujillo, where Cubans trained in a little cay or a little island off the coast of Cuba to invade the Dominican Republic. They trained in weapons use and so on, in military tactics. And that ended in nothing. That was 1947. The other more interesting event was the Bogotazo, where Fidel Castro was in Bogota in 1948, and he participated in the riots and the violence in Bogota that happened during the Inter-American meeting there, and he distributed anti-U.S. propaganda. He roamed the streets with a rifle. He went into a radio station. So Fidel Castro, at an early age, showed a propensity toward violence, and particularly a strong anti-American bias feeling position. Castro tried an attack on a military barracks in Santiago de Cuba in Oriente province in 1953. A lot of people have looked at this as a suicidal attack whereby a number of students and supporters of Castro stormed this barrack and so on. It looks on the surface a suicidal attack, but when you understand what he was trying to do, it wasn't suicidal. Fidel Castro wanted to capture this military barrack and transmit a message to the people of Cuba, to the military, and to the Ortodoxos. And he was assuming now the leadership of the Ortodoxo Party. So if you read the speech that he had prepared, he talked about, I'm the leader of the Ortodoxo, this is an Ortodoxo revolution, and join me and let's overthrow the Batista regime. So it was a masterful coup, had it been successful, in which he would have captured the party, he would have become the inheritor of Chivas's political rhetoric and his political party, and be able to become a national leader in Cuba, which he wasn't in 1953. Most of the attackers were killed. Castro expected the guard to be asleep or drunk because it was during the carnival. The military was very alert, so a lot of the attackers were killed. Fidel Castro was in the third wave of the attackers, so he was able to escape. He ran into the mountains, and then he was later on brought to trial and sentenced to jail. Most of the people that were arrested were executed, tortured, executed by the Batista regime. So there was a significant revulsion among the Cubans the way the military had treated the attackers. I don't know if you can call them martyrs, but they were, from the point of view of the bulk of the Cuban population, a bunch of young students that sacrificed their life and were willing to do this suicidal type attack against the military. So there was pity, not necessarily martyrdom here. Fidel was sent to jail, was arrested and tried and sentenced to jail. And then he was, after 2 years, freed by Batista, and he left for Cuba and went to Mexico, where he organized an expedition, the Granma expedition. He and 81 others landed in Cuba and began guerrilla operations in the mountains of Cuba.
Up to this point, they're back in Cuba. Is there any talk of communism, socialism, anything like that?
No. Batista was using a little bit of the propaganda, saying that these people that were involved with Castro were communists, that there were communists in his movement. But I mean, the majority of the Cuban people didn't pay attention to Batista's propaganda and didn't know much about Fidel Castro either. He was fairly unknown in Cuba. He was not a well-known political leader, except for the attack on the Moncala. And you have to understand also that press censorship was instituted throughout Cuba from the 1954-55 on. So the media was not reporting very much on what was happening in Cuba. Batista instituted censorship of the press. It was a unique press censorship because it was for 6 months. And then after 6 months, Batista had to go in front of Congress to ask for another 6 months. But that one day that the press was not censored, they published everything that had happened the prior 6 months. So if you read the newspapers or Cuba's magazine, you have to look for that one day every 6 months where the press would report on what happened, and then 6 months you had total censorship. Well, Batista tried to pretend that he was a constitutional president, that he followed the Constitution of 1940, and he was, again, elected in 1954, quote unquote, in a faked election where he was the only candidate. So he now tried to maintain the trappings of constitutional government in Cuba. The Cuban Socialist Party, which is the Cuban Communist Party, which is a Moscow-oriented communist party, criticized Fidel Castro's attack on the Moncada barrack as a pushist attack, also criticized the attack on the presidential palace by other leaders to try to kill Batista, and were critical up to the end of 1957, early 1958. By early 1958, there was a shift of the position of the Communist Party. And they follow a dual strategy. While publicly they try to support Batista and maintain a relationship of friendship, they send a number of officials of the party to the mountains to join Fidel Castro. So by February of 1958, the Communist Party, the Partido Socialista Popular, had a unified command with Fidel Castro and with other groups in the Sierra.
Well, do you think that Castro was always communist, or when did he become communist?
Well, that's a very difficult question to answer. I think Castro was basically anti-American when he was in the mountains. He wanted power for himself, wanted to destroy Cuban society, and he knew that in doing all those three things, he needed somebody to support him. So he probably either in the Sierra Maestra or even before began to think about what he needed to transform Cuba to remain in power indefinitely and to create an anti-American revolution. And for that, he needed the support of the Soviet Union. Ideologically, Fidel Castro had been anti-American since he was a student at Belén, where he admired Primo de Rivera, the fascist ideology, and emerged out of the Jesuit school in Cuba with a very strong anti-American feeling. He read Lenin's works while he was in jail, and Raúl definitely was a member of the Communist Party. So at that point, I think the ideological formation of Castro began prior to him landing in Cuba in the Granma, and probably during the mountain period, he began to accept an ideology that would provide him with control of Cuba, a total transformation of Cuba, and an ally in the Soviet Union that would support him. Well, number one, I don't think Fidel Castro had a clear ideology or was the kind of individual that would follow an ideology. Che Guevara and Raúl were more disciplined, more organized, probably, and they did follow Marxism, and they were both communists. I don't know that Fidel was pushed by Raúl and Che. Fidel had a tactical intuition, and he was concerned after he came to power that to provoke an American intervention in Cuba. So he was playing the tactical game, whereas Raúl and Che were more strategically oriented and wanted to move Cuba quickly toward the communist camp. So there is some difference here, but I think it was a difference of tactics, not necessarily of ideology.
Okay, the January 1, 1959, the revolution triumphs. What was the feeling in general in Cuba? What was the atmosphere?
Now, the atmosphere was euphoria. The dictatorship had ended. The period of violence that had taken place against Batista came to an end. So people welcomed the rebels, welcomed Fidel Castro, and he was the man of the hour.
What were the hopes for the future at that point?
Enormous. I mean, Fidel Castro had cast himself as a follower of Chivas, of the Ortodoxo. He talked about restoring the Constitution of 1940, only cleaning out the corruption, having elections in a couple of years. So the promises of the revolutionaries and the hopes of the Cuban people were in unison. In other words, a return to the Constitution of 1940, democracy, freedom. Castro never talked about destroying private property, confiscating American property. None of that thing, that was kept behind. Oh no, he was promising things to gain support, to consolidate power. I think he already had in mind what he wanted to do in Cuba. Fidel Castro began a series of public trials of Batista supporters. I think it was significant support in Cuba for these trials. These people were seen as murderers, people that had broken the Constitution of 1940, that had established a military dictatorship. So many people felt that they deserved to be punished, and although many people didn't like the televised speeches and the televised executions and the televised trial, they accepted those things. As it became more and more radical and more people were being executed, there was a natural reaction against this kind of thing among the Cuban people. What happened is that they stopped with the executing the Batista supporters, and then they began to execute people that had been with Castro, that Castro accused them of being traitors, and arresting people. So the revolution moved from cleaning the old regime to begin to clean its own people. Cuba was a train that began to accelerate after January of 1959, and the acceleration was to the left. Castro began to confiscate property. Castro began to arrest people that he didn't trust. He began to attack the United States. So a lot of people began to worry that this was not the revolution that they had thought for, that they had wanted for Cuba, that Cuba was being too radicalized. So many people began to oppose the regime. People that had supported Fidel Castro began to either conspire, go underground, or many went into exile. Contacts between Castro and the Soviets were in two ways. There were contacts through the Partido Socialista Popular, the Communist Party, and through Raúl Castro. In April of 1959, the Soviet Union sent to Cuba and established in Cuba a TASS, which is the Soviet news agency, an office in Cuba. The head of that office, as it turned out, was not a newspaperman, but was a colonel in the KGB, Alexei Alexeyev, who became a very critical figure in talking to Fidel Castro, in sending messages to the Soviet Union about the radicalization of the revolution, and later became Soviet ambassador to Cuba. No, the Soviets didn't have to do anything. Castro was moving toward the left throughout 1959 and early 1960. The Soviets began to establish commercial relations with Cuba, to provide Cuba with aid, and eventually to sell Cuba petroleum and refine Soviet petroleum in Cuba. And at that point, the Eisenhower administration decided to break relations with Cuba. This was early 1960. And then the Soviets began to move more rapidly. I think the one event that accelerated Soviet involvement in Cuba was the Bay of Pigs invasion. The failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion gave the Soviets illusions that they could bring in nuclear missiles into Cuba and that the United States wasn't going to react. They analyzed the failure of the United States to act in support of the rebels and to overthrow Fidel Castro in 1961 as a sign of weakness on the part of the Kennedy administration. And therefore, they began to plan more military involvement in Cuba and eventually the bringing of the missiles. Well, Huber Matos was a very respected commander, one of the 3 or 4 top commanders of the Cuban Revolution. So within the ranks of Fidel Castro, it created a lot of uncertainty, created a lot of concern about the radicalization of the revolution. Huber Matos was an honest, without reproach individual. So his criticism of communism in the government had some effect on a lot of people. Well, Huber Matos was first of all, the Camilo Cienfuegos disappearance occurred. and which later on people have claimed that Camilo Cienfuegos was assassinated by Fidel and Raul. But the second event was, or the first event was the Uber Matos, and then the Camilo Cienfuegos disappearance. So those two things began to get people to think, well, where is this going? What are these people all about? And so it created a lot of uncertainty in Cuba. Cuba, like many countries in Latin America, had a upper class, a middle class, and a poor class. It was not a impoverished country like Haiti or like other countries. Cuba, by all standard, was comparable to Costa Rica, to Uruguay, and to the more developed Argentina, the more developed countries of Latin America. It had a very strong middle class. It was a modern country. Sure, there was poverty. There was difference between the rural areas and the cities, but Cuba had significant amount of hospitals, was a very good medical system. Literacy rate by the United Nations standard was 89%, so Cuba was not an illiterate country. So yes, the revolution has made significant improvements in the medicine and in the education, but Cuba didn't start from the lower end. It started from a very high end. And Cuba was a fairly modern, very close economy to that of the United States.
Okay. Now, these groups that I'm doing the story on, at one point there are at least 800 of them that go up to Escambray, most in Escambray and scattered all over the place. Why do you think, wouldn't the U.S., especially during the planning of Bay of Pigs, try to put a significant effort in arming these people and incorporating them into the invasion? Why do you think that happened?
Well, in part, the United States in the 1959-60 period was preoccupied with Berlin, with crises in Europe. The focus of attention wasn't in Cuba. As the revolution began to radicalize, the United States began to pay more attention to what was happening in Cuba. But the response of the administration was in terms of organizing a D-Day type expedition like Eisenhower had organized in Europe to land in Cuba, the group of Cubans land in Cuba, capture a beachhead, and then the United States would enter and support that beachhead and end the Castro regime. So that was the thinking of the planning of the Eisenhower administration, which was at the end of Eisenhower's period, and that was the plan that was passed on to the Kennedy administration. Kennedy was indecisive. Kennedy wasn't sure that this thing would be successful without American involvement. He did not want the American troops to become involved, so he began to change the planning, and nobody really confronted him and said, look, this is going to fail unless American involvement. This group of 1,200 Cubans are not going to overthrow the Castro government. So Kennedy didn't have the decisiveness necessary and the leadership necessary to end the Castro regime, so he vacillated, and this thing was a disaster. No, the thing that caught off the resistance in Cuba was 1961 and the Bay of Pigs. The Bay of Pigs dealt a massive blow to the opposition in Cuba. Castro rounded thousands of suspected and real opponents of his regime, killed them, threw them in jail. So there was a massive cleaning up of the opposition in Cuba as a result of the Bay of Pigs. So by the time of the missile crisis, the opposition had dwindled in Cuba. It was not a strong opposition.
Okay. And finally, I read somewhere that by 1960 there were already well over 100,000 people that had come already to Florida. What impact did the exodus of Cubans have on the ability to organize a strong opposition?
No, I think that the people that left in the first wave were people that were connected with the Batista regime. And they were not people that had made money and left. I don't think that the initial exile exodus had a lot to do with organizing an opposition. By 1961, before the Bay of Pigs, there was a significant opposition organized in Cuba, supported by the United States, that had significant power and significant capabilities to do a lot of things. The Bay of Pigs destroyed that opposition, and they never regained that kind of power. No, I don't know that you can blame the CIA. I think the CIA and the Department of Defense planned an invasion of Cuba in 1960 under Eisenhower that contemplated the use of American troops. If the invasion were going to fail, the U.S. had planes there, had an aircraft carrier in the waters of Cuba during the Bay of Pigs invasion. So they had the troops. The decision was not to get American troops involved, not to get American planes involved. So I think that decision, which was made by Kennedy and the White House, turned the possibility of victory into defeat.